Hey, this is Professor Rogers, and this is a video on how to combine unadjusted and adjusted models in the same APA table. This is one of the quickie videos that we're doing this semester to address issues in my graduate classes. In particular, we'll be showing you how to combine step number 3 and step number 4 if you speak the lingo of my classes. Unadjusted means bivariate. So for example, I can have simple OLS regressions, one for each of the variables, independent or control variables in my model. So I can combine all of those in a single column, and then I can have a different column for my adjusted models. There are three ways to make a table in APA 7. One is to use the table feature in Word. The second is to use an Excel spreadsheet and then copy and paste the spreadsheet into Word. And the third is to use the output from a statistical software package. I do not like the third option with SPSS there for two reasons. One, there is a box to check on some procedures that says make an APA table. I have found that what comes out does not look like the examples of an APA table. So that's one reason not to use that if we think that the appearance matters. The second reason is that often in tables we are, especially with regression models, we are combining the results of multiple equations. So the output doesn't exist. We don't report a separate table for every single regression that we run and want to report the results on. We combine them to save space and so that we can make easy comparisons. And that's what we're going to do here. I personally prefer to make my tables in Word, so I use the table tool. And the table tool, I have it highlighted there on the left. It's under the insert menu. The result is here. I'm going to be using 6 columns. You'll notice that the cell borders are on. They're on automatically when I use that tool. We will be showing you later how to take those out. First thing I did is fill out the titles and all the labels and things in the table. So you see I have the table number. I have the title there. The title runs across multiple columns. So what you can do is you can highlight the columns, right click on that, and you'll see coming up in the menu a way to merge the tables, the columns. So I did the column merge here. But you'll still see I use the italics. I do want my table to stand alone, so you want all the facts there. So somewhere you want to put the sample size, so I have that next to my title. If you have multiple equations where the sample size might vary, you might put the sample size down at the bottom, maybe with the goodness of fit statistic. But in this case, it's the same sample size for all my models, so I just put it at the top. Then the next two rows are my column headers. I'm going to report both the unstandardized and standardized beta for each model. Again, you have lots of choices here about whether to report the unstandardized or standardized number. I will not review that whole issue here, but you do want to mark which model they're in. You'll notice that unstandardized and unadjusted and adjusted are also places where I merged cells. On the left, you see the variables themselves. Region is a block of dummy variables. By itself, it's a nominal variable, but we have to break it into dummy variables because we can't run the nominal variable in the regression procedure. My reference category is south, so you notice that I've marked that along with region. And I'm also using log of percent black and the poverty rate. And I also am going to include the constant because I have the unstandardized beta, so I need the constant to be complete. And I'll be using the R, or what we call the multiple R in the case of the adjusted model, as my goodness of fit statistic. You'll notice at the bottom I have my footnote in place. Again, I had to use a merge across the columns for that. So let's begin. We're going to go variable by variable. So I'll start with the hardest one here, and that's the region variable. So here are my coefficients up in the upper right-hand corner from the SPS output, which I take both of them and I copy them down into my table. This is a hand copy. I suppose there's a way you can cut and paste that. If you want to figure that out, please go ahead and do so. It comes out automatically left justified, and then I use asterisks with the unstandardized beta to communicate the statistical significance of my result. Here I do the same thing with the log of percent black. Here's the final unadjusted result with poverty rate. And so what I have on this table is I have three models summarized together. You go, how does the reader know that that's three models? Well, that's because I called it unadjusted. That's what I'm communicating. And you are allowed in APA to assume that the basic statistics like means, standard deviations, and OLS regression and binary logistic regression, you're allowed to assume that the reader knows what these statistics are. And the use of the terms unadjusted and adjusted, you're also allowed to assume that the reader knows what those mean. You will notice that the constant and the R are left blank. That's because I have three constants and I have three R's. I don't try to report all those. The purpose of the comparison that I'm doing here is to allow us to compare the coefficients. We're very interested in that because usually when we're testing a hypothesis, that hypothesis lies in the with one of the variables. So I happen to be interested in whether crime rates are higher in the South. So South is my reference category, and I'm comparing everything to the South. So I want to know, how do these compare? Are these comparisons the same as I move across this table here? If you need to report those other things, so let's say as part of your discussion, you want to highlight the change in the goodness of fit as we go from the unadjusted models to the adjusted models, then you need a different way to report that. So that could be multiple columns for the unadjusted variables. That could be, some people will create a separate table just to report goodness of fit statistics. In this particular case, I see no need to report the goodness of fit for the unadjusted models, but if you do, keep that in mind, that you have to then change what I am talking about here and adapt to that situation. APA simply tells you what the shell of the table should look like. It doesn't tell you all the information you need to provide. So that's a very important point to remember. So now the adjusted model. So I copy down the results of everything in the same equation. Note that here I did add the constant. Since I have the unstandardized beta for the adjusted model, I wanted to complete the set, and I'm also now reporting the goodness of fit statistic. So now I have the ability to make comparisons from the unadjusted to the adjusted to see if any of my coefficients have changed once I have the adjusted model in which the results of every coefficient is adjusted for everything else that appears in this equation. Some people also want to put in a row for the dependent variable, but you don't need to do that because there are no metrics associated with the dependent variable. But you want your reader to know what the dependent variable is. So you'll notice that I have it up there at my title. So we do know that I am trying to estimate the violent crime rate. Now I'm doing some additional editing to make the table look pretty. You'll notice initially that center area was the same size as all the other columns. So that area between the unadjusted and adjusted, I shrunk it. So if you move your mouse over with the cursor, you can latch onto the line and move the entire line for the whole table. You don't have to go cell by cell. If you move a single cell, you didn't do it right, pull it back and then try again until you get that whole cell. You may have to learn how to do that. Um, Also, I realigned the cells, the columns appropriately, and I centered the numbers. So they were initially left justified. I have used tabs to center them. You can apply the tab to the whole column at the same time. There is some debate here, so uh, editors don't always like the tabs. They want to put that in themselves. APA 7 does show a number of examples without the tabs, but I can also show you APA 7 examples with the centering done. I prefer the centering because it's a nice table, and there may be people who are reading your table independent of the final copy that would appear in the published work. Now I removed the cell borders. And the way to do that's up above. In the paragraph tool, there is a drop-down menu for choices with borders. I have circled it here. Um, so you can highlight your whole table and in one swoop take all the borders out of the table. And that's what I did. And then I went and reconstructed where the column spanner should be. So underneath the title, I put the first column spanner. Underneath the headings for unstandardized and standardized beta, I put the second column spanner, which separates the header from the main body of the table. And then above the footnote at the bottom, I put the third column spanner. As a top border of that cell. All APA tables should have those three column spanners. I also underlined unadjusted and adjusted. It's traditional to have a minor column spanner if you have a tiered heading like I have here. So this is my final table, and it allows me to compare the unadjusted and adjusted results very easily. The whole point of this is to see if there are major changes in the coefficients as we go from the unadjusted or simple relationships to the adjusted model. And if there are, we have more work to do. So one of the things we need to do is go back to our bivariate correlations and our crosstabs and look at the relationships between the independent variables. So we want to see how the independent variables are affecting each other. If we see a correlation of at least 0.7, we have a condition that we call collinearity. That means there's a very high correlation between the independent variables, and this correlation may be affecting our model. We would either take out one of the variables, or we might find a way to transform or remeasure it. There you have many options, and you have to look at your particular situation. 0.7 is not an arbitrary number, so you square that and you get 0.49. Once you get over 0.49 or 0.50, that means that between these two variables, 50% of the variance of one variable and the other is explained by the presence of the other. Or the majority of the variance is now being explained by the other variable. So then the question becomes, what variable are you measuring? With your measure, are you measuring that variable, or is the computer picking up the other variable? So that's why 0.7 is kind of the threshold that we look at. You can also have what we call multicollinearity. A variable could be affected by a group of variables. So the effect of any single independent variable on your variable, then we're talking within the independent variable. So I take like percent the poverty rate, and I might see that the whole string of independent variables affects poverty rate, even though I can't isolate that to a single one. That's multicollinearity. And the simplest test for that is to use the variance inflation factor, which is easily produced in SPSS. So with one of the option tabs in SPSS, you can ask for this. It's called the collinearity statistic. So you check that, and on your third table on the bottom where the parameters of your line are, you will get these two additional columns. The VIF is the variance inflation factor. The rule of thumb is you want the VIF to be less than 10. So I clearly have that in this case. I would conclude that I have no multicollinearity. Now, I may also, in this situation, want to check my regression diagnostics to make sure it's not an outlier or some pattern that I did not see that's affecting the outcome. That is, you should be checking this anyways, but the importance of this now becomes heightened if you see some evidence of collinearity or multicollinearity. And finally, if you're looking for multicollinearity, you might run regressions. Use one of your independent variables as the dependent variable. So you're going to get rid of your dependent variable, like the log of the violent crime rate. Then start using your independent variables one at a time as dependent variables and run all the other variables against that to see what happens. This would be an appropriate place to use the backward stepwise procedure if you know about that and take the variables out one at a time until only you have significant relationships left. This is the presentation for today. So keep in mind our point. Our point is that you can combine the results of your bivariate model with your final model with all of the variables included. And you can do it in a single table. It's easy to read. Now that's the format for my classes, and that is adequate. But you may have another point. You may want to explore different parts of the model. So if you are in health sciences and you're looking at health disparities, you have those groups of variables in the Anderson model. So you have your predisposing factors and your enabling factors and your need factors. Well, you might have a column for unadjusted statistics and then a column for your predisposing factors and your column for your enabling factors and your column for your need factors and then a final thing combined. So my point is don't get so wedded to this format that you lose track of the analysis that you're trying to do. All what I'm saying is here for the purposes of the class, here is a simple format. It is one that's used in journals, so there's some acceptance of that, and it makes it fairly easy to report a lot of information and drive us to the key point of how, how our hypothesis, how the variables in our hypothesis work together, both in the simple model and in the case of the adjusted model. Thanks. I hope all this made sense. Have a great week.